Hi and welcome back to the Journey to Nebula Sew Along. I'm Julie Herman of Jaybird Quilts and I'll be your guide on this journey. This week we are going to work on piecing the Gazebo Table Topper using the half hexagons and triangles that we cut last week. Let's get started. Our first step is to sew our small triangles to our half hexagons. We're going to do this for our A and for our B fabrics, and we're going to do 6 of each of these. We want to sew these together with a scant 1/4 inch seam, and we're going to use the same machine settings that we've been using throughout the journey, which is I'm using a 2.5 stitch length, scant 1/4 inch seam, sewing with R-Fill 50 weight. My favorite color is 2600. It's that perfect medium gray that blends in. I'm not going to go ahead and pin these, but if you feel more comfortable doing that, go ahead. And last week I had instructed you, or 2 weeks ago, for our previous project to cut all of the points off when we were doing candy dish, and it was relevant to that project. Some people asked if that's necessary right now, and it's not. For this project, we just need one blunt corner, and you might think to piece it this way because of grain, but it's going to be just fine the way the entire project goes together by sewing it this way. So we're going to start out with that notch right at the top where the angle of our half hexagon is, and then we're going to end up with a little valley here, and what we want to sew is from that point to that valley. I'm going to get my stiletto to keep things nice and flat. And I'm going to continue doing this for all of my A and B half hexagons. We are now going to press these seams open, and if you prefer to press them to one side, that is something you can do with this pattern. It won't interfere. Things won't necessarily nest by pressing to one side, but it won't interfere as much as with some of the other ones. So as usual, I'm going to use my handy dandy seam roller, and then I am going to press in between steps here because our next piece is going to intersect this seam directly. So I'm going to press, and if I wasn't filming I would be using steam. It's just a little too loud. And now that I have these pressed, I'm going to head back to my sewing machine to sew my next step. The next step is to sew these two pieces together, my A and B half hexagons, and I like to put my A on top of my B so that my piece with the seam is on top and my complete piece is on the bottom. And I'm going to line up these hexagon cut off points here and line up my triangle is going to hang off over the top up there. And I'm going to get my 1/4 inch seam and sew these two together. Use my stiletto to hold everything in place. And I'm going to repeat this step with all 6 sets. Now I'm going to press my next seam open, and I do suggest you press this one open because these seams are eventually going to intersect with lots of other pieces when you put your wedges together, so it is helpful to minimize bulk by pressing this seam open. And then I'll head back to my machine and go ahead and add my next piece. The next step is to add our C half hexagon onto our piece we're going to continue to grow. And again, I will piece with this part on the bottom and this part on the top so that I can see the seam. I'm going to line up my notched edge down here, and my triangle point's going to hang over my half hexagon, but these sides are going to line up perfectly. And I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch seam. I'm going to use my stiletto to help me keep everything lined up. And I'm going to repeat this step with all 6 sets. And now it's time to press this one. And again, I do suggest pressing this open because we're going to have lots of things intersecting here. It might feel natural to just press it to the side, but it is advised to press it open. So I'm going to use my seam roller. And so I'm going to press. Friendly reminder, pressing is up and down with a little wiggle. Ironing is back and forth. We don't want to iron because we have some bias and we don't want to stretch things. So once we get that one pieced and pressed, we're going to go get our next piece. Next step is to add D to the other side. We added C to this side. We're going to add D to this side. And again, I'm going to flip it over so that my complete piece is on the bottom and my pieced piece is on top. And I'm going to line up this part, and basically where the seam allowance is where that's going to line up. So that little point's going to end up right next to the seam. And then down here, it's going to line up here. And it looks like mine's off by a little bit, which happens sometimes. So when I get to the machine, I'm going to use my stiletto to pull everything gently into place. Get this 1/4 seam started. And if you can see, I'm a little bit short here on the top. Sometimes that happens with the seams, despite the scant 1/4 seam. So I'm just going to pull this piece gently to line it up, hold my stiletto, and sew my 1/4 seam. And I'll repeat this process with all 6 of my pieces. Now that we have added our D half hexagon, it's time to press again. Lots of back and forth from the machine to pressing with this project, but it really does yield a more accurate construction if you take the time to go back and forth between the pressing and sewing. You can save some time by chain piecing and doing all 6 wedges at one time. So once you have D1 pressed, go ahead and find your E half hexagon. In continuing to build, our next piece is E, and this one especially you want to sew with this piece on the bottom so that you can keep an eye on the intersection of this point and make sure that you don't sew too far in. So we're just going to line up the corner right here, and then we'll line up this one and sew another 1/4 seam. It's really just like building upon building with this design. So I'm going to slow down as I get to here, make sure I sew right at that point so I don't sew it off. And continue. And again, rinse and repeat for all 6. Now I have this one added, and this one, if you prefer, you can press just towards this piece. It won't interfere with the overall construction. These points have lots of things coming at them. These do not. That being said, I prefer consistency, so once I begin pressing a project open, I tend to press the entire thing open. But I know some of you are not as big a fan, so I like to tell you when it is more necessary than other times. So I use my seam roller and then my iron. I give it a little bit of a press on this side now that I have most of my pieces together. And now I can go ahead and add my large triangles, which will complete this piece to make it a triangle. Our final step to complete each of the triangle wedges is to sew our large triangles onto the piece that we've been creating. And again, gonna line this up and then flip it. So I'm gonna have my notched corner down here, and my dog ear is gonna hang off over here. And this way I'm gonna have straight of grain all on the edge of my finished project. And now because none of these seams overlap, I can go ahead and sew both of my triangles onto each piece without stopping to press. So this one just going to get pressed up here. So this triangle is going to go here. So I'm going to line up my notched corner. My triangle is going to overhang. I'm going to flip it upside down and sew my 1/4 inch seam. And repeat with all 6 of my triangle wedges. Now I have sewn my 2 triangles on, which completes my large triangle, and I would press these open because they are going to intersect with each other when you go to put the wedges together. So just like all the other ones, I'm gonna roll my seam with my handy dandy seam roller, and then I'm going to press with my iron. Give it a little bit of a wiggle, and same with this one. And there's not as tricky pressing with this one, so I haven't been using my iron finger or my stiletto, but those always do come in handy if you need them. And then give everything a little press on this side and complete all 6 of my wedges. I've now completed sewing all 6 of my wedges and laid them back out. And the next step is to sew my wedges together, these 2, and then add this one to create my half hexagon. And what I'm going to do is the hang pin technique, which we did a few weeks ago, and I will show that to you up close at the sewing machine. We'll be sewing our 1/4 inch seam to sew these 2 triangles together, and we want to make sure that these points line up as best as possible. So we're going to use the hang pin technique that I showed you some weeks back, so I will give you a quick refresher. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a straight pin and we're going to go in right where that point is. And so I'm going to come out on the other side right where the point is. And then on my second piece, and this is why we're doing stuff like this, if you see like I'm a little off here, but that's not going to matter because we're going to be focused on where the point is. And we're going to stick our pin in, and then we're going to let it hang there. And what we're going to do is we're going to push these 2 pieces together, and we're going to keep the pin straight. We're going to make sure it doesn't wiggle one way or the other. We're going to keep it so that it is perpendicular to our fabric piece, and then we're going to take 2 other pins and put them on either side of the piece. So we're going to put one there, and we're going to put one there. And now we've secured our piece together in exactly the right place, so we're actually going to remove the hang pin. So you start with the hang pin, then you add the 2 pins on the side, and then you remove the hang pin. And I find it best with this piece to sew with your seam on the top. You could start from the outside with your triangles, but I find it easiest to start from the inside out. And so we're just going to match these up as well, kind of pull them into place a little bit without distorting where our hang pin pinned us in place here. We're just going to start to sew our 1/4 inch. Of course, I'm getting caught. That happens sometimes. All right, and we're going to use our stiletto as we go. Smooth that out. And as we get close, I happen to pin on the other side, so I'm going to pull the pin out from below. You might have your pins on this side, depending on which side you started on. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew real slow up to this and make sure that I get right in that groove there, and sew right to the tip of that point without sewing that point off. And I've got a lot of bulk, so I'm getting stuck a little bit. And I'm going to continue, and I'm going to kind of pull to line these 2 up as best as possible. Slow when I get to the seam, use my stiletto, and finish sewing this seam. And since I don't plan to add a border to this, I will do a little bit of back stitching here just to hold that in place since it is now the end of my piece. Now that I have my 1/4 inch sewn, I'm going to go ahead and press the seam here open. And since there is more going on, I will use my heat resistant stiletto. Still going to do a quick roll with my seam roller because it really does help get things open and started. So I'm going to just walk along my seam using my stiletto to keep things open so that I don't accidentally burn my finger. And again, if I was not filming, I would be using steam, but I have that turned off. And so there we go with our first seam. And now we're going to go ahead and add our third piece onto these two. It's now time to add our additional triangle on, so we're going to repeat the same steps with the hang pin, and we're going to start by placing the pin right where our point is, and then going right through our other side. And we're going to push them together and get that lined up straight. Make sure our pin stays in straight, and then we will use one pin on either side to hold that all in place. That's what it should look like. And then we're going to pull that pin out. And again, I find it best to sew from the inside of the table topper to the outside. So I'm going to sew that same 1/4 inch seam. As I get close to my pin, I'm going to pull it out. What happened last time is I had a piece of fabric that got stuck in my presser foot. So hopefully that won't happen this time. I'm going to slowly sew up to that point. And there we go. And remove our last pin. Then we're going to line these up. Continue to use our stiletto to help us out. And then sew to the end of our piece. Now that I have that seam sewn, I'm going to go ahead and press that one open as well. Again, I'm going to use my seam roller just to get it started. And I'm going to use my heat resistant stiletto to keep everything open, make sure that I don't burn my fingers. And I like to turn it over to the other side and give it a good press. And then I'm just going to go repeat those steps with my other 3 to complete the other half of my table topper. Now that it's time to sew our 2 halves together to complete our table topper, you could just sew the entire length. But what I find works the best is doing the hang pin in 3 places, doing it here, doing it in the center, and then doing it here. So it's the same places that we were doing it in the previous steps, and in the center as well. And depending on what your center fabrics are, your center point is actually not the most important because it's kind of blend together, but you really want to make sure that these line up. So do the hang pin in those 3 places. Now that I have my pins in those 3 places, I'm going to do a quick little 1 inch of stitching at each of those locations, and I'm going to open it up and check and make sure everything lines up before I sew the entire length of the piece. Now that I've sewn those points, I'm going to open it up and check them. And it looks like this one looks really good. And it looks like that one looks really good. And it looks like, unfortunately, this one doesn't. It looks like something slipped. So I'm gonna unpick these stitches and redo that section. I took that seam out and redid it, and I'm much happier with the results this time. So now that I basically have thread pinned these 3 locations in place, I'm gonna put my 2 halves right sides together and sew along the length. Now, you can sew along the entire length. I find it sometimes easiest to sew from the center out and do the 2 halves. You do what seems to make the most sense for you. Again, I would suggest back stitching at the beginning and end of these triangles since you're not adding a border to your piece. And when you get to the area that you've already sewn, just sew right on top of where you've already sewn, and no one will realize in your finished piece that you have 2 sets of thread there. Repeat that right here. And one final time. I've now finished piecing my gazebo table topper, and I'm going to layer and quilt mine with Soft and Stable. This is an alternative to batting. That's a product by Annie that is a little bit less than a 1/4 inch thick, and it is a foam that really gives some nice body. I find it works great on table toppers, so if you've never tried it, check it out. So go ahead, finish your table topper and take a picture, post it to Instagram, and use the hashtag Journey to Nebula to be entered into this week's giveaway. And if you have any questions, go ahead and ask them where you're watching this video. And I will see you back here next week to start our bonus pillowcase pattern.